Hello, I'm Nick Ellis, and today I'm going to be talking about essentials of a theory of language cognition. By which I mean, if your theory of language cognition doesn't have these elements, then it's not a complete theory of language acquisition. I'll try and identify 4 or 5 aspects which I see to be essential and consider what each of them is and what each of them does in terms of informing language cognition, both our theories, but also language learners, what they get out of it. And towards the end, I will also consider what these elements give to theories of language instruction. So, essentials of a theory of language cognition. If you want to get any references or further ideas, you can look on my website, where a lot of the papers I cite are available. Essentials of a theory of language cognition. There's a little mnemonic here which allows us to identify 4 or 5 of the major elements. When I started interests in reading and other aspects of language in the 1970s, cognitive psychology was trying to do this. It was trying to identify the departments of the mind and how they communicate, the major modules. Although, as we'll see as we get through this talk, along with many others, I believe that modules are made, not born. So in the 1970s, this was the beginning model. That there are different forms of memory and information is recoded from one system to the next. We'll see in a moment how those ideas developed. As I got more and more into second language acquisition in the 80s and 1990s, linguistics was questing after the essential elements, mental elements of language. And it had modules, it had theories pretty much like this. This is from Viv Cook's summary of the metaphor of universal grammar from the book Implicit and Explicit Memory for Language. And pretty much there is linguistic input, but the key aspect for our understanding of first and second language acquisition is access to universal grammar. So those are the 2 strands which are informing many of us today as we think about second language acquisition and usage-based approaches to second language acquisition. So cognitive psychology was looking for these components of departments of the mind. UG was looking for essential aspects of the language acquisition device as it affects our language cognition. And perversely, at that time, these 2 were autistic to each other. Linguistics thought that the essential components of the language acquisition device are divorced from general principles of cognition. And that we were to think about principles and parameters and access to universal grammar, either directly to the second language that we were exposed to, or via the first language. And so the debate was whether or not there was full access to UG, partial access to UG, no access to UG. This was pretty much the starting point. Now, cognitive psychology has come a long way since the 1970s. We started with a computational analogy for language cognition, which is that there is some input, we perceive something out there in the world, our cognitive system processes this, it looks up things in memory, it combines things in working memory, we think, we imagine, we initiate actions. So pretty much this is the classic sandwich view of cognition, which is there is perception, there is some cognition that works on what is perceived, and that is used to initiate actions. As time went on, we recognized some interactions between perception and memory, which is that cognition initiates actions, the actions change the state of the world, and so there is a cycle of interaction. And you can think of the sorts of cycles that were being talked about then, the cycle of interaction, or NICE's the cycle of perception, which is that we see a stimulus out there in the world, we think it might be something like that. That top-down processing guides our hypothesis search, and we look out there at that perceptual event again, trying to confirm or disconfirm that initial hypothesis. Things got more, thousands and thousands of cognitive psychological experiments led to models like this. This was very much the modal model of reading in the 1980s, informed by cognitive psychological experiments, psycholinguistic experiments, the neuropsychology of reading, where these departments of the mind, letter identification, looking at the visual input, the orthographic visual analysis, access to semantics, access to phonology, different routes to phonology, either direct lookup or grapheme phoneme conversion. This was very much the modal view, confirmed by many, many experiments. Crossing between experiments and neuropsychology. And over time, there was the rise of connectionism. This sort of model led us to believe that there are associative mappings between vision and phonology. Those mappings are from graphemes to phonemes. The mappings are probabilistic. And so we need to understand those probabilities of mapping. And that led to the rise of connectionism, parallel distributed processing models of statistical inference as we recode from one representation to another. And nowadays, with the advent of brain imaging, we can do our clever experiments, look at what areas of the brain are involved, and see the interconnections of those areas of the brain. And I guess we are somewhere here now, informed by all of these different theories of cognition. But it's still very much the case that what we're investigating is cognition in the head. And as I rather glibly reviewed in 2008, this is good old-fashioned psycholinguistics, so stealing from Maggie Bowden and good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, good old-fashioned psycholinguistics, focusing on the language learner as an associative network, a mechanistic processor of information, relatively unembodied, unconscious, All of these things are pretty much unconscious in their activation. Monologic, these are language users sitting in a psycholinguistics lab on their own with headphones on. Unsituated, not in everyday, the wild of language use. Asocial, uncultured. These models don't say very much about schooling or bilingual social contexts or anything else, and pretty much untutored. So that's 20th century psychology. We've learned an awful lot from it, but it was very much language cognition in the head. What's happened since then, perhaps in the last 20 or 30 years, beginning with Eleanor Roche, perhaps, but it's the recognition that cognition isn't in the head. Cognition extends well beyond the skull and the skin. And these are the ideas which feed into our recognizing these essentials of a theory of language cognition. The notion that we are embodied and that this brain talks to the world via these perceptual transducers. That we act out our cognition in the world, that it has consequences in our behaviors, and those behaviors in turn affect our cognition. That our cognition is embedded, we are embedded in society, a society now, the significant others and the significant institutions which affect where we live and how we get along, but also the origins of that society in time. So our culture. And that we have an extended mind that when we are cognizing, as I am doing now, I'm thinking about this PowerPoint presentation, this writing system that I use to make notes, this Zoom call, you out there in the world who I'm trying to communicate with. And I've learned a little bit about you, a very little bit, sadly too little, from my interactions with people from your culture, my friends in China, but also from reading about people in the world. So this is embodiment, enactivism, embeddedness, the extended mind, sometimes known as 4E cognition, sometimes known as post-Cartesian cognitive science. The notion that cognition is not just in the head, it is unbounded. This is distributed cognition in the world. We need to think about not one person's cognition in their head, but a cognitive ecology. Along the way, I'm going to add another E, which has been part of my thinking for 30 years or so, 40 years or so, emergentism. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. So, embodied cognition. We have these associative networks, which do mappings from different modalities. But these networks are, the input and output to them is through the body. I love this quote from Merleau-Ponty. The body is our general medium for having a world, a medium like writing or the movies. The body is our medium for having a world. We have these networks, but these networks are part of us acting out physically in a real world with its gravity and its laws of physics and its routine ways of dealing with the world. And if I want to understand a verb like push, then I need to know something about action dynamics and physics and the routine artifacts we have made, which we push in the world or allow us to push better in the world. These notions of embodiment, Eleanor Roche, starting embodied cognition, but within linguistics, cognitive linguistics particularly, George Lakoff, Women, Fire and Dangerous Things. If we're thinking about those mental representations, those symbolic representations, well, as we've learned from AI, they are not enough. They need to be grounded in the world. And Lakoff was powerful in his making us realize that symbols are grounded in things that are meaningful to begin with. Two sorts of groundings: basic level concepts and kinesthetic image schemas. Basic level concepts, the concepts that cut across vision and motor action. Basic level context like a hammer. Hammers all pretty much look like that, and we do pretty much that with all hammers. Fruit, apples. Apples are basic level concepts. They all look pretty much like that, and we do that with them. So our grounding, our apple, is understood by visual representations of apples, motoric representations of apples, and our other perceptual systems, so taste as well. So what Lakoff did for the things out there in the world, which was the beginnings of cognitive linguistics, Langacker did for acting in the world, things that happen in the world, verbing in the world. Langacker developed cognitive grammar, the notion that all linguistic structures are meaningful, all linguistic structures are meaningful, and the meanings of these structures can be described in cognitive terms. What's crucially important is the space that we live in, and relations within that space. What's crucially important are things that happen in that space. They matter to us. Events happening in space and having consequences in time. And what language is for is to allow us to communicate those really important relations in as unambiguous a way as possible, preferably without being in the here and now of our interlocutors. So, embodied cognition has crucial effects on language and how it works. And you hear in a conference on cognitive linguistics, usage-based linguistics, and second language acquisition, you know about all of these foundational books and ideas in embodied cognition. So that's our first E. Our second E is enactivism. The notion that, yes, our cognition takes place, but it takes place not just here, it takes place in a world, and that world plays out in routine ways. So the way that football reacts to the motoric actions of our footballer here is predictable to that very skilled footballer. who has gone through those routines many times before. We can think about a ball reacting in space and the routine physics of those interactions. We can think about people as they interact with us, and they too have expected reactions to what we do in a particular physical world. And we can think about the societal ways in which we have gotten used to interacting with people in culturally evolved multi-person routines. All of these are entrenched in our minds and in our expectations of the world, so that they can inform us in places that we've never been before. So that drop me in a forest that I've never been to before, but I can get ideas about where to go by looking at the way in which people who've been there before have negotiated their ways through that space by looking at the paths that have been entrenched by those who have gone before. As my friend Rob Stepney said, a path is the wisdom of many feet. So embodied cognition, enactivism, embeddedness. We have these associative networks, but those associative networks talk to other associative networks that are embodied in other significant conspecifics, in the people who are important to us and who interact with us every day of our life. We don't learn our language by reading books or listening to the radio, as infants at least. We learn our language richly tutored in a cooperative culture where our parents are trying to identify important things in the world and how they work. We share intentions. We share consciousness. We cooperate. We try to communicate. Infants share attention with their caregivers. They follow their gaze. They share intentions with their caregivers. They have shared goals. They cooperate. And Tomasello has done much to champion in first language acquisition the crucial importance in shared understanding and shared intentions, these origins of cultural cooperation and collaborative communication. It's embedded in a social, caring structure. And we've talked about that from Tomasello and first language acquisition, but there are strong links in second language acquisition too, in this notion of minds in society. Jim Lantolf has done much, particularly to champion these sociocultural inspirations to second language acquisition. Finally, the extended mind, informed, championed very well by Stephen Hutchins, distributed cognition. Distributed cognition, he was studying cognition in a closed multi-person social system. How do cockpits work? How do people in a cockpit successfully make a plane, take off and land. He's interested in knowledge not only within one individual, but in these individuals' social and physical environment. The coordination between individuals' artifacts and the environment. And for sure, we know about that. And right now, in year 2022, we know about that, where here we are talking across the world using these technological systems and innovations which allow us right now to talk across the world. My understanding is so enriched by access to cognition around the world. Think about how often you access the internet each day to read a book, or read a PDF, or read a colleague's papers, or look something up on Wikipedia, or talk to a friend. The cognition in my head is routinely enmeshed and extended by these systems. Again, championed by Andy Clark, perhaps his wonderful explorations in supersizing the mind, cognitive extension, and the major burden of coupling between cognizing agents is through language itself. This is what we're using right now to share our understandings. And John Schumann often talks about his colleague Logan, the notion that it is language that extends the brain into a mind capable of conceptualization, the idea that mind is brain and language. So the extended mind, society is our extended mind and body. We are embedded in a society which, sure, we have these regularly recurring interactions in regularly recurring contexts of use. And yes, we have these neurobiological capacities and these mental modules which we've tuned by experience, but that experience has come from routine interactions with our families, our significant others, in our places of usual interaction, our places of work, our places of worship, our social organizations. We are part of a larger society, enmeshed in something which eventually has some government, where we've accepted some rules of behavior, or some routines of interaction, some socio-cultural institutions and communities, which has particular ideological structures, which are not just here and now, but which have been passed down as belief systems through the ages. And many of those ideas and actions have become concretized in various artifacts, computers, and technologies that allow us to share pictures, verbal and non-verbal interaction, or gosh, you can share my face and you can share my eyebrows, and that will affect how you interpret this particular message. So these are the ideas that we championed in the Douglas Fir Group paper in whenever that was, 2016, 17, a transdisciplinary framework for second language acquisition in a multilingual world. So those are our 4Es: embodied cognition, enactivism, embeddedness, the extended mind. These are things which I view to be essential to a theory of language cognition. And I'm pleased to say that I've been thinking about them, certainly not completely, but I've been thinking about these things for some time now. The notion that, as in cognitive linguistics, We learn constructions, morphological, syntactic, lexical forms, which cue particular semantic, pragmatic discourse functions. These constructions are represented in connectionist networks, cross-modal connectionist networks. We learn those networks from usage. Usage has particular shapes. The power laws, scale-free distributions of usage tune those networks in particular ways. We don't have statistically flat cognition. There are hotspots of cognition which are particularly telling for how language works. Our usage is embodied. It's crucial how we attend to the world. Language is important for allowing us to do that, but our conspecifics are important in telling us which bits of the world to attend to. These interactions drive our attention and our consciousness. We are socially interacting, and at times we are doing our learning in instructional and cultural contexts. That was a slide that I made in 2007 in a second language acquisition symposium organized by Sue Gass and Alison Mackey, they coming from an interactionist informed second language acquisition. There have been many such elements of the social turn in second language acquisition theory. Jim Lantolf, Bonnie Norton, Elaine Theron, sociolinguistic approaches, Claire Cranch, cultural approaches, conversational analysis, Gabby Casper, Joss Wagner, language socialization, interactionist approaches, sociocultural, sociocognitive approaches, Dwight Atkinson, the sort of things which were gathered in the Douglas Fir group, all agree that cognition is socially grounded in interaction. As Wagner said, cognition is not understood as information processing, but as organized, embodied interactions between social actors in meaningful ecologies and reflexively being shaped by those situated encounters. Although the degree to which these approaches buy into issues of embodiment and ecology, they share a common understanding of learning as happening in context, through praxis, in everyday activities of communities of language users. The target for many second language learners is not just to speak another language, but to become part of the social and cultural environment in which the language is used. This entails frequent and rich participation in the second language life worlds into which the language learner bricolages his or her way. So the learner is not learning a language from a book or a grammar. The learner should be learning a language in the wild. Hutchins, Cognition in the Wild. The learner should be learning the language in the wild, where there are these cues and these affordances and these enmeshings in a routine social structure. And some researchers like Steve Thorne have picked up on that term rewilding, which is now being talked about in ecology and species preservation, and started to apply it to language learning too, where he's trying to adapt these he and other individuals trying to make use of communicative technologies nowadays, trying to rewild language activation, trying to put us back into those social situations. Now, all of these views of language cognition, all of these ease of language cognition, have informed each of our language competencies. That's not to say that they have to be there all of the time. Having gone through all of those experiences, you can take the language learner and you can abduct him from or her from their normal routines, and you can stick them in a psycholinguistic cubicle, and you can ask them questions with their headphones on, and you can put them in front of keyboards and measure their reaction times, and you can ask them about things. And you can tap into that isolated mind. And when you ask it some questions, it can tell you things. Just like Proust could tell you what entered his mind as he tasted that Madeleine. And you can read Proust's remembrances of those times past and those wonderfully embodied, perceptually grounded memories of parts of his life long gone. But he can recreate them from his mind, and he can talk about them with his linguistic system very successfully, because yes, he does have language in his mind, but it's come from all of those interactions. Language is now in his head, now in his body. Language is now in him. These are the ideas, I think, the essential ideas in usage-based approaches to second language acquisition. I'm running out of time, but I will use these last 3 minutes to fly through some slides, which, well, you've seen them before from me, but you can read them in the PowerPoint. Language abilities, competencies coming from the sediments of usage events that are left as acquired linguistic constructions in the individual language learner. We have many writings on these usage-based approaches. Here are some of mine and colleagues in usage-based approaches to second language acquisition. Here are some of the many things which are components themselves of the usage-based approaches. Usage-based approaches to second language acquisition remind us that all of those E's are important. Looking at language through any single lens does not do the phenomena justice. Yes, we should acknowledge the social turn, but it doesn't deny any of these other elements that I've been talking about. It doesn't limit any theoretical approach to one of those cognitive or psycholinguistic viewpoints. It shouldn't limit any educational approach to any one particular aspect of those social interactions. Instead, it calls for greater transdisciplinarity, diversity, and collaboration in our investigations of language. I am particularly impressed and have been impressed by ideas of emergentism. I was first influenced by Brian McWhinney. That strand very much continues. Emergentists believe that simple learning mechanisms operating in and across the human systems for perception, motor action, and cognition, as they're exposed to language data as part of a communicatively rich human social environment by an organism eager to exploit the functionality of language, suffices to drive the emergence of complex language representations. Language and usage are like the shoreline and the sea. There are many books which take some of these ideas and try to inform practice, educational practice. The top and bottom rows here are very much from usage-based or cognitive linguistic influences. Those in the middle here would not necessarily call themselves usage-based or cognitive linguistic, but they're very much taking similar ideas and trying to inform education by developing task-based social interaction situations from which we can optimally learn language. And I think all of these and many others are fine collections on thinking about how to take these ideas and put them into language instruction. Over my career, I have much been informed by Mike Long, and here's a small tribute to Mike Long, who sadly left us last year. Some of these ideas, the language emergence or language as a complex adaptive system, have played out in my thinking from the beginnings of emergentism and language in language, but particularly from this collaboration, this meeting at the University of Michigan, which was then with all of these fine people. I thank them for their collaboration and their influence, and these ideas summarized at times in the notion of language as a complex adaptive system. I think this moral is a good one. I will leave it for you to look at in your own time. I've printed it once or twice at the end of particular papers. Some of the ideas I've been talking about today are available as full papers, and you can get them from my website. I particularly recommend the written version of this paper, which was published 2 or 3 years ago in the Modern Language Journal, Essentials of a Theory of Language Cognition. I revisited it very briefly this year in a bilingual language acquisition context, looking at new research, looking in great detail and great empirical sophistication from Titone and Tiv on language cognition in multilingual societies. I have played these ideas through as far as I can, most recently for the acquisition of second language morphology, and I've tried to give a broad perspective on the acquisition of second language morphology in this rather long paper, but I'm excited about it because it's one of the most recent papers that I've written. That's on second language morphology acquisition. My wonderful colleagues Uta Römer and Matt O'Donnell and I did a monograph on cognitive and corpus investigations of the acquisition of construction grammar 5 or 6 years ago now. The Douglas Fir Group I've referred to, you can get that paper automatically from the Modern Language Journal site or download it from here. Many of these ideas we first summarized, Peter Robinson and I first summarized in 2008 in the Handbook of Cognitive Linguistics and Second Language Acquisition. They are briefly summarized in a chapter which has got some traction, jointly authored with my wonderful colleague Steffi Wolf, in a collection from Van Patten, Keating, and Wolf, Theories in Second Language Acquisition. You can get papers and the odd talk that I've given from my home site. That's it. I'm a few minutes over. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.